All right. Well, hopefully you watched the Brady Bunch clip and saw, Rogerian parenting, punishment in action. Like that's the kind of punishment that Rogers would advocate for. When you went to watch that video, you might have noticed there was a parental guidance label on the front of it. And then when you watch the content, you're like, why would this have a parental guidance on it? This is one of those problems with who can make complaints on YouTube, because I think it's there because the actor who played the dad is gay. And I think that's why it's there. Somebody complained and it's never been removed. I've had people complain about my human sexuality videos, and I actually just push back. I'm like, this is educational. Why would there be a block? Like my students are having to verify that they're over 18 to watch this video. This is ridiculous. It's educational. There's nothing prurient in here. All illustrations are drawings. Like, what are you talking about? And they took the block off of it. So whoever posted that needs to push back on YouTube, because there's nothing objectionable in that video. I think you can agree. Actually, the person who played the maid was also gay. So, I mean, it's possible I think that's the only thing that could possibly have caused that block. Anyway, so the last thing that Rogers says that we all need to receive from our parents is empathy. We need them to tune into our feelings, show an effort to understand our feelings, and to listen to our feelings. We need to feel heard, and we need to feel understood. So it's not just that they, let us talk and then they say, okay, well, are you done? and then tell us how it's going to be. They listen to what we have to say. They say, okay, well, what you're saying makes sense, but here's why we're making the decision that we're making. Like, I understand what you're saying. Maybe I can alter a little bit my decision based on your argument. I was really lucky because my parents were very much like this, and really my dad in particular was very much like this. And so if I ever had something that I wanted to do or a rule I wanted changed, I would always go to my dad and ask him, and then he would talk to my mom about it, and they'd decide together whether they were changing the rule or not. And he was always really willing to listen to what I had to say. I would lay out my little case for why I thought the rule should be different. And then he would always say, I got to talk to your mom about it, right? And then they together usually would come and talk to me. And my mom asked, why do you always go to your dad? And I'm like, well, because he actually considers what I'm saying. He doesn't just tell me why the rule is what the rule is and like that. I remember in particular when I was 15 and the rule was I couldn't date till I was 16. And I asked if I could go out on a date with somebody. I asked my dad, and that might sound a little backwards, like wasn't he the one who made the rule? But I have no idea how they had decided 16 was the age, but they, a lot of times parenting rules are arbitrary, or they're sort of what was done in their childhood, things like that. And so I talked to my dad about it, talked to him about who I wanted to go out with and what we wanted to do and stuff. And so he listened, and then he talked to my mom about it. I would just like to argue that it all went fine on that date, and then now I was allowed to date. And so then the next person I went out with, we stayed out till like 3 o'clock in the morning, and that was the end of dating for me. So my parents did have punishment in their toolkit. So, because they said you have to be home by midnight, we need to know where you are. This is back in the olden days where we didn't have cell phones. And so, 3 o'clock in the morning, I got home, my mom was going nuts. Like, where was I? I could have been in a ditch, as she said. And once I became a parent, I totally get what she was upset about. I knew I was fine, so what would they be worrying about, right? So they were willing to listen, they were willing to alter the rules, and then in the long run, I violated, and we went back to what things were, right? The punishment was, we're going back to what it was. So this is what Carl Rogers says that we need to receive from our parents in order for us to have a chance to develop in a healthy way, so that we can be, as adults, genuine, display unconditional positive regard towards others, and show empathy towards others. Like, he thought that that's what a fully functioning person looks like, is that they can be authentic with themselves and with others, they can show acceptance to other people, and they can be empathetic to other people. All right, so Rogers argued that our major responsibility in life is toward growing and maturing, to becoming ourselves, and that it's our job as people to always be growing, maturing, and ultimately take responsibility for ourselves. I think this is a lifelong thing. I don't know to what degree Rogers thought that you got to a certain age and then you were done growing and developing, but I would argue that I guess I'm kind of like Erickson in this way, that you probably all through even your adulthood, you're growing and maturing in different ways. I was telling my daughter when she told me she was pregnant with her first child, I'm like, okay, so first you make me a mom. That was my choice. Okay. Then you get married. So now I become a mother-in-law. Was not really ready for this, being a mother-in-law. Not sure I'm ready to be, that I'm mature enough to be in this weird gray area of you're the same age as my child, but you're not really my child. And I'm like, I'm a mom. And then she tells me, okay, and then now you're going to be a grandma. I'm like, I just mastered mom, like seriously. And then you make me have to be a pseudo not mom to somebody else. And then now I'm going to be a like pseudo not even close to mom to somebody. Like I'm completely confused. But the good news is, you do have this responsibility to grow and mature into whatever role that you're occupying. You have to be yourself within that role. And so, it's been my firstborn grandchild is turning 4 this year in a couple of months. And so it's been 4 years of practice. And I feel like I've matured into my role. I have to say there are moments of immature grandma status that I think I go into sometimes of, frustration or jealousy or exasperation or things that I'm like, oh, if I was a better grandma, I wouldn't feel these things or express these things. And I have to take responsibility for that, right? Trying to become my best self. And so all of us have to take responsibility for ourselves. And Rogers says, it's common to sort of like look back on our childhood and say, well, my parents didn't do all those things that I needed, or the people around me aren't giving me what I need to be my full self, or these kinds of things. But he says that ultimately maturity will be revealed when we say, okay, this is my life. And it doesn't matter what happened to me in my childhood anymore. I have to take responsibility for myself from this point forward. And that, yeah, there are wounds, and yeah, there are dissatisfactions, and there are all those things. There are, traumas, other things. Sorry, I forgot to mute my phone. There are all those things that we all have, that all of us carry around with us. But he says that our goal, our job, our responsibility is to put those things behind us, or let those things inform us as we move forward to become our best selves as adults. Congruence is where you have a match. Congruent means that two things match. So congruent is when there's a similarity between the phenomenal field, he called it. That's like how we see the world and how the world sees us, and then our actual self. That is what he calls being congruent. And being congruent, where what we put out and how people perceive us, and then how we see ourselves, when that matches, or how we're seeing other people and how that informs our sense of self, when those things match, we're going to be a fully functioning person. We're going to have healthy personalities, he says. Incongruent is when there are conditions of worth that either, we're working under, somebody has put these conditions of worth on us, our parents, or, somebody that we're in a love relationship with or a friendship with. We feel like they're only caring about us as long as we continue to fulfill whatever constraints they've placed on us. Or it could be flipped. You're the one putting constraints on somebody else. And the love that you have for that person is contingent on them continuing to behave in the ways that you want. When there's that dissimilarity between, the phenomenal field and the self, then that's when we're going to have what Rogers calls mental disturbance. A non-fully functioning person, a person who's functioning at less than optimal. When we have congruence, he says that we can be optimistic, we can be flexible, we can be creative, we can feel our emotions for what they are. We don't try to hide from them. We are willing to accept the emotions that we're experiencing. And we're more likely to have what's known as an internal locus of valuation. That means we value ourselves from inside ourselves. Like our value comes from how we see ourselves. Our value isn't dependent on how others regard us. Our value is internal. So when we have congruence, when we can have a similarity between our phenomenal field and ourself, we can have all of these healthy, fully functioning characteristics. So Rogers has some pretty strong words for us if we don't take responsibility and try to become whoever we are and try to make congruence between ourselves, our true selves, and then the world and how the world reacts to us and stuff like that. He says that we are actually not fulfilling our job. All right, so here we have somebody looking in the mirror. He says, we have our self-concept, and then we have our ideal self. The self we think we should be, or that we're striving toward. So you've got striving toward, that's good. Like, okay, this is what I want to be like. This is how I want to be. I remember when I first moved out of the house, I said, you know what? I'm going to have a healthy diet. In the household I grew up in, here's the big shortcoming. My mom was not much of a cook. And she would not buy like anything that could be prepared very quickly. She was really big on ingredients for things that need to be made. So we had, for breakfast, we had oatmeal and cream of wheat, right? We didn't have things like, and in those days they didn't have, I don't think we even had granola bars back then in the olden days of my youth. They might have had granola bars, the really dry, the ones that stab you in the roof of your mouth, that ones. They didn't have the chewy ones. They didn't have anything good. So nothing to like grab and take. Yogurt came in a big tub, or you got these little cups and they were like half gelatin. They weren't really the yogurt that you have today. They had all these thickeners in them. So they weren't even that healthy. Long story short, we didn't have a lot of the things in my house, or probably in the world, that made for a very easy, healthy diet. And so when I moved out, I thought, you know what, I'm going to try and overcome this. And so I got like grape nuts in the house, and I got these kinds of things that I was going to eat all the time. And I had like this ideal self of how I was going to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning. I was going to do my little workout. I was going to eat my, my grape nuts and my glass of orange juice, and, start the day. And I'd always pack my own little lunch and stuff like that. Because my self-concept, I said, is of a healthy person who does these things. And I strived for that. And I did a pretty good job for a while. But then, slowly but surely, the ideal self starts to wane as you start to realize, wow, this is really hard. And so I had to finally abandon the idea that I was really that devoted to eating really well. Convenience was definitely more important to me, and definitely I have a sugar problem. I think I might have mentioned that before. I have a sugar problem. So my self-concept, I finally had to absorb into it the fact that parts of what I had been holding up as like my goal for how I wanted to be was probably not ever going to really be fully achieved. And that's okay. Like, okay, I accept that my ideal self is a little bit different from what I had originally set out to be. That's okay. Now your self-concept is, the core part of your personality. It's your personal sense of your nature and your identity and who you are and what it means to be you. The ideal self is how you would like to be. To use a term from Karen Horney, it might be what you think you should be. And that's where the ideal self becomes harmful, is when you have internalized conditions of worth from other people and have said, well, no one will love me. Not just the person who put the conditions of worth on me, but no one will love me. And in fact, I am unlovable unless I get rid of these things or I do those things. That's where the ideal self can be harmful, is when we've internalized other people's values instead of just, putting our own goals into that ideal self. So having said all this, self-acceptance is not, I don't think it's ever fully achieved, because there's always something that'll remind us that we're not perfect or achieving our ideal self as we've personally defined it. We want to move on from defending against, the perception of conditions of worth and these kinds of things. We want to be open to loving other people and caring for other people and showing empathy and, acceptance to other people. But I think the big takeaway is that this is a work in progress all the time, our entire lives. So it's not like you get to, puberty and like in Freudian theory and, oh, you've reached your full self. Like, that's not how this model works. This model says, you're always adjusting your ideal self. Hopefully you are, right? Like, once you've achieved certain goals, now let's make some new ones. right? Some new, like how I would like to be, or where I would like to be in the next 5 years, or things like that. Like hopefully you're always adjusting it, but hopefully not on the basis of other people's values. Not feeling like if I don't do these things, nobody's going to love me. And I mean, it's really hard. It's a human instinct to want to have other people love us and care about us. So it's really hard not to sort of internalize what we think we should be like in order to be lovable and worthwhile. So, all right. That concludes Rogers. Let's come back in the next segment. We'll talk about his colleague, Abraham Maslow.